One thing that you got to be careful of is you fidget, and I can't hear you fidgeting on the call, but I can hear you fidgeting in the recording.
Yes, I'm aware of my fidgetiness.
Is that a thing? It's like a stimming helps you focus?
I don't know. It's just like a...
Or are you just so passionate about the ideas?
Yeah, I'll go with that one. No, I'm so fidgety. I'm always, if you just watch me, I move so much more than normal people do. I don't know what it is. It's kind of nervous disorder.
Eric is a bright and insightful child, but I encourage him to sit in his desk and keep his hands to himself, or we are going to have to medicate him.
ADHD, baby.
Hi, listener. If you are a filthy casual, you might not have heard from us in a bit, but if you do patronize us, you will have heard our David Graeber and the other David episodes. We did a postmodernism episode. You know, the David Graeber book has really stuck in my head. You know that Dawn of Everything? When you read something in an academic context, you kind of most of the time forget about it, but every once in a while one of them like sticks in your head. Twilight of the Idols by Nietzsche is another book that always sticks in my head. But I've been finding, since we read it, that one has when they say everyone thinks this, and you're like, well, I'm not really sure that everyone thinks that. But then you metaphorically step out of your door, which means unlocking your phone, let's be real. But then everyone is saying the thing that he's saying everyone says, and then you're like, okay, David, it do be like that. The Age of Empires picture of history, as we called it.
Yeah. It's like they all exist in the media sphere. It's weird. Yeah, you talk to people out on the street. They're like, yeah, we understand that the picture is probably more complicated than that. But then, yeah.
Anyway, that was PillPod 127. This is PillPod 130, and it is only myself and yourself, Eric Tate's self.
And me.
Victor
Eric.
is off getting a tan at the cottage. You know, to people who are not in Ontario, when we say we're going to the cottage, there's a lot of lakes north of the urban sprawl that is Toronto and the cities attached to Toronto. But up where all the little lakes are, going to the cottage means driving north and getting an Airbnb on the lake, unless your friend has rich parents. That's always a bonus.
They own a place up there. Yeah.
But you know, Eric, in BC, no one says cottage. I never heard that till I came here. We say the cabin.
Oh, the cabin. Yeah. I could see that.
I wonder what the difference is, because the first time I heard Torontonians saying, we're going to the cottage, the signified of the cottage to me is like a fairy tale thing. Like Little Red Riding Hood's grandma has a cottage, but if you're going to the lake, you're going to the cabin.
Yeah, cabin feels more outback, like it covers more just backcountry kind of situations, and made of logs. A cottage, I could expect it to be made of stone or brick, or even like little siding houses, like you could call them a cottage. I think cottage just has a kind of a wider application. But then, yeah, you guys say cabin instead of cottage, so I don't know.
Well, I assume as the language evolved back in the day, there would have been many more cabins on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest. So maybe that's why.
I'm picturing log cabins like made out of giant redwood trees.
Like New Yorkers say, I'm going upstate, right? They don't even mention the building.
Oh, God. Don't quiz me on that. I have no idea.
Okay. Well, anyway, Victor's not here. That's the point. Would you like to talk any shit about Victor while he's gone? We can air some grievances.
Well, I mean, this connects to last week's article that he wanted us to read, what we're going to be doing today. Because one of the key terms of that one was biocultures. And this week we're talking about nature cultures. And he does exactly, I think the article that we looked at last week does exactly what this text we are reading says not to do, which is to make an asymmetrical distinction between nature and human culture, non-human nature and human culture, and then you distribute unevenly properties to both of those separate containers of things. And so he does exactly that. He goes on talking about body cultures and how biology and politics are intertwined. And then he goes, but we must distinguish the human from other animals. And then by fiat, deus ex machina, we're back in liberal politics, but with a little bit of evolutionary biology.
Yeah, we're not doing that.
He kind of reconstitutes the modernist constitution there. Yeah, that's my own. I talk shit about the article that he chose, but I mean, there's some great swipes at liberalism here too. So
yeah, this is the post-humanist side of the podcast, and we are doing a post-humanist reading, something that actually just gets Eric off. It's one of his favorite authors. Well, why don't we just talk about it? We picked something that we like. I think our very first episode ever on this podcast was on this guy. Not this book, but the book is We Have Never Been Modern, Bruno Latour. Does science know anything? Is he alive still? Let me just check.
No, he died quite recently, actually.
Oh, fuck. He died last year.
Yeah.
COVID?
Yeah, very recently.
No, not COVID. Dude, so many of the French homies we've gone through, they died during COVID, but none of them actually from COVID. Like Stiegler, Jean-Luc Nancy, Michel Serres.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, that's like that whole generation. Latour cites Serres, definitely. Wow, yeah.
Or Serres, as it looks on paper to Anglophones. You know who never fucking dies is Habermas. Soon to celebrate his 1 millionth birth. The German theorists, they just live long, maybe because they smoke less. Like Gadamer died when he was 104 or some shit.
Yeah, maybe it's a diet thing. I don't know. Habermas, maybe centrists just live longer. Who knows? They should do some kind of study, because Habermas did kind of pull back from the more radical attitude of the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, that's probably what Zizek's trying to do this week.
Yeah,
pull to the center so you can pump out another couple years. Well, I'm looking at this list you just sent me, which is, what is it called? The Humanities Citation Ranking. So I guess in terms of popularity, these are the most cited theorist types.
Yeah, and humanities, social sciences, and art scholars.
Yeah, so kind of no surprise, Michel Foucault is number 1.
Top of the dog pile.
I was shocked to see here, Bruno Latour is number 10th.
Yeah.
Ahead of such figures as Sigmund Freud and Immanuel Kant and Martin Heidegger. And I was disappointed to see that Nietzsche's in like 37th.
Yeah.
Marx, 36.
Yeah, we got old David Harvey out there. Yeah, Karl Marx and Nietzsche are pulling up the bottom, just below Jacques Lacan and Thomas Kuhn. Yeah, I've seen other rankings, and like Noam Chomsky cleans up in some of the other rankings though.
Yeah, here we got Noam Chomsky. Speaking of someone who won't die, he's at 15 here.
Yeah.
But the top 10 are Foucault, Bourdieu. That's kind of interesting to see. Derrida.
Number 3.
Some psychologists, Bandura and Giddens, who I've never heard of. Irving Goffman. Habermas at number 7. 1929 dash. It does not have his date of death yet. Weber at 8. Judith Butler at 9. And Bruno Latour rounding out at number 10.
Yeah, this is a humanities ranking index. There's many different ways to measure these sorts of things. I'm not really sure of the parameters of this one. Imagine it's kind of internal to philosophy, sociology, psychology, anthropology, etc.
Yeah, it looks like academic citations rather than like New York Times citations. It appears that way.
Barth, yeah. I mean, yeah, I've at least heard of all these people. George Lakoff too. We talked about him the other day. The metaphors we live by guy. All
right, so if we're turning to the topic, We Have Never Been Modern. And this does not mean we've never been modern in the TikTok sense. I have to tell you about this. I'm sure you haven't seen it because you're disserting rather than browsing. But TikTok, there was a thing. I think it's a few months old, but I just found out about it. It's the funniest thing. We were at one time modern, and we used to interpret the world scientifically. You know, that's the story. But TikTok is causing people to revert to like primitive animism. So have you seen the mirror trend on TikTok?
Oh God, no! What is it? You have to copy someone else's movements. Is that the
No,
goal?
It's much worse. It's much worse than you could imagine. It's
Oh,
you
God.
take a piece of paper and you put it on the mirror, and then you put something, on your side of the piece of paper, and then they move the camera to the mirror, and then they can see the object in the mirror and freak out like, "Oh my God, how can the mirror see that?" Because there's no direct light lines to
Oh,
the
okay.
mirror.
Yeah.
And they wonder how you can see it, because the Zoomers, of course, believe that the mirror is a screen projection as a phone screen, so it has its own perspective, because phones do, and phones are all they know. They don't understand that, no, the light is bouncing from the object to the mirror to your eye. And they got one of them, I think this one had to be a joke, but the little writing on the TikTok was like, "Mirrors, how do they know?" And this spiraled off into "Mirrors are a separate universe," which I believe is the premise of a Borges short story. The mirror people are going to return one day.
So the theory is that light only bounces at 90-degree angles and nothing else.
Yes, this is an unintended consequence of having smartphones. Is we believe that light is always at 90 degrees or perpendicular to the surface.
Oh God,
Anyway.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like it's such an interesting phenomenon. It's like, cool, how does that happen? Or like seeing how people are getting freaked out over it. And then you start looking at how people are explaining it, and you're like, oh my God, like the theories that start rolling through are just like fucking bananas. It's always the quiet part that's not said that you start to worry about. It's like, how are you explaining that?
But this is the benefit. This is what makes modern life more interesting, because science has made it too boring, as we'll talk about. Fucking science, What is it
Ironic. It's done. We have everything now. We have social media.
How do magnets work, as the Insane Clown Posse asked?
the famous question. The paradigm shifting question.
Honestly, how do magnets work? I took physics 12 or whatever, and I know there's like certain elements that have missing electron, whatever, and then if they're facing the right direction, then it has a poles. But I don't know. Fucking magnets.
Oh, there's a parallel universe, much like the mirror world, but everything just goes in the opposite directions. And when things get crossed over, there's magnetism. When the boundaries between the worlds start to thin out, there's my new theory.
This is good. This is better than probably the actual explanation. It's like those the symposia, excuse me, when the drunk upper crust of Athenian society would just come up with explanations for things like love. Yeah. We all used to be giant fat 2-part creatures, and everyone's looking for their other half. This is kind of actually interesting, as it does get to the topic of Latour. Pre-modern peoples, just like us, because we've never been modern, science is never on its own discovering facts and shit, which is sort of a supposition that maybe some scientists, but mostly people that don't really do science but like to talk about it, like I don't know, Neil deGrasse Tyson types, think science just answers questions and facts and discovers things and shit like that. So if you look at the real world and you look at COVID, look at global warming, actually we had the hottest day in recorded history this week, I think.
Yeah, I think I saw that highest average temperatures ever recorded on Earth. Yeah,
we don't want to do that woke shit.
Hail in a handbasket. He talks about climate change here too, which is very surprising. It's like a persistent theme. because the first climate change conference happened in 1989, which is an important date, as we'll see. But yeah, he's talking about climate change, because he wants to connect everything, right? Ozone layer to scientific labs to politics to scientists, and he brings in all these different elements.
Yeah, basically saying that there's no private objective island that science happens on that's separate from everything else. So like we make, and you can expect us to make, COVID is not a scientific issue. It's a political issue as well at the same time. It's a matter of concern. Same thing with global warming. It's funny that global warming is being called woke now. But anyway, that's where we are. Our actual topic today, as we said, we were never modern, but we have to, before we actually get to the content of the book, talk about the science wars, which I know is something you are an expert on, so I'll shut up and let you talk about it. But when we're speaking of infectious diseases, I want to set you up here because I always remember this anecdote from Alan Sokal. And if you don't know, listener, if you don't know Sokal, he is the guy who proved that critical theorists are all intellectual imposters and we don't actually know anything.
Yeah.
Through the SoCal affair, when he was able to publish some complete gibberish articles in presumably critical theorist magazines. But I don't want to go too much into that because at the same time as this was happening, SoCal had an opinion on Bruno Latour, and he called him, this is not verbatim, but it basically called him a moron because there was some pharaoh who died, who was a mummy. But the pharaoh, they tested on the pharaoh's body and they found tuberculosis or whatever signs of tuberculosis are.
Yes.
And then said, okay, this pharaoh, probably a Ramesses, I'm not sure, but the pharaoh died of tuberculosis. And Latour responds to this humorously saying, like, it's impossible for someone to die from a disease that was invented in the 19th century. And Sokal, I think Sokal is a scientist or some STEM thing, but he was very indignant because the scientists had done tests on the mummy and found out that there was tuberculosis in it, so it's proved. And this postmodern neo-Marxist is out here saying he didn't die from tuberculosis because tuberculosis was invented in the 19th century. So I'd like it if you could, I'm sure there's people who are sympathetic, like of course he died from tuberculosis. Why, from Bruno Latour's perspective, can you say that something that has existed for so long was invented when it was discovered?
Yeah, it's such a weird thing to say when you don't know where he's coming from. Because I guess what his Alan Sokal's a mathematician and his co-author on the famous book Fashionable Nonsense. Jean Bricmont is his co-author, Belgian theoretical physicist. So these two hard scientists did a big takedown of all the ways that newfangled postmodern theorists are adopting the language of science and subverting it and using it in ways that are not consistent with, I guess, its mathematical elaborations and its theoretical physical acceptations. So they wrote a big angry reactionary book about it and accused I guess you'd accuse him of not believing in reality. He's got that question before. So it's like, well, if what really killed this pharaoh is tuberculosis, then how can we say that he didn't die of tuberculosis? Well, the answer is, I guess you have to understand what he means by it. Tuberculosis hadn't been invented yet. Sometimes he uses the word invented, discovered in a hyphenated fashion. Because when it's a really complicated thing to diagnose a disease, right? You don't see tuberculosis or you don't see a disease. You see a set of symptoms, and it might share with other diseases, right? And today we've isolated tuberculosis, or that happened in the 19th century, I think. And then we can start to look at history and develop more techniques, right? Because we got to develop archaeological techniques to excavate these things. We got to develop microscopes and the right tools to do it. We need laboratories. We need funding. We need all these sorts of things to be in place before tuberculosis can be a thing. Tuberculosis wasn't just like an idea floating around that some Egyptian pharaoh caught one day, and then tuberculosis was a thing. So you have to understand it as a kind of network effort. You know, the history of tuberculosis started with the Egyptians and ended, and I guess it was like a long birth, and it was finally born in the 19th century. But the labor pains took a few thousand years. You could probably look at it that way, maybe a little more neutrally.
So there are facts. I don't think anyone is denying that. But the fact has all these tendrils that is produced at the end of a process. And to say, okay, this fact has now arrived. It has no history. It has no social context. And we can use this fact on its own as distinct from that. I guess it's an artificial way to think about a knowledge process. Is that what you think is happening here?
I mean, you can say it's good short form to say, yeah, he died of tuberculosis. But when you look at the way that scientific facts are actually established, there's so much complexity there that Latour wants us to slow down and trace these networks in detail rather than just kind of flattening them all out, brushing them aside, and just jumping to the final product, which is tuberculosis has always existed, or at least has always existed, or at least came to be in the last 300,000 years of human history, or something like that, right?
Another way to phrase it might be to ask the question of whether knowledge is produced over time by accidents and contingencies, or whether knowledge itself is just a reflection of the world as it is.
Yeah, you have to look at it as a network, and you have to look at it in terms of all of these different things that are in play. And there's no one. It goes back to what you were saying, right? We think people make discoveries and inventions in isolation. It's like, you know, we have this individualist theory of history, just like we have an individualist theory of science, right? Did Newton, all on his own, straight out of his own brain, come up with the things he did? No, Nikola Tesla helped him along, right? And I'm sure there's many other uncredited computers.
Newton and Tesla are not contemporaries.
Sorry, Edison and Tesla.
Edison.
I misspoke. Yeah, and I'm sure there's a whole load of unnamed men and women who are involved in that process, but we take all that away and we attribute it to, you know, Edison. And we're doing the same thing. We're taking all that effort and history of science and discovery and everything. We're just removing all of this nature, culture, political imbroglios. we're erasing all of that and just jumping to the saying he has tuberculosis. Well, how does he have it? Well, and how do we know? And that you can sort of then start maybe tracing it backwards and getting away from that. But, you know, it's that flattening out of this complicated networky system of discovery that I think he is most concerned with. So of course he believes in reality. Of course he believes that when we are talking about tuberculosis, we are talking about tuberculosis itself and not a representation in discourse, not a cultural idea. We're talking about a real thing, but it's about how facts are made, how facts are forged, and the efforts that go into, you know, establishing something as a fact. It's not like someone discovers something in a lab and then boom, it's universal human knowledge. No, there's a process of generalization and distribution of this information. There's peer review. There's all kinds of things, right? And again, it goes not just the scientific side, but socially, politically, economically. And that's what, I mean, that's, I guess his efforts to bring us to attend to those sorts of things makes him make statements like that sound really weird to people.
I mean, we have to say he's being intentionally provocative, of course, but the provocation is to draw attention to the fact that calling something in whatever 3rd millennium BC, calling it tuberculosis is an anachronism. But in the anachronism itself, we're flattening out every type of reality, including matters of concern, which is another one of his terms. But things that people care about, we're flattening it all to there's one real world, and then there's all the fake stuff on top of it. The fake stuff is what humans are interested in. Maybe we call it subjective as opposed to objective, which is one of those dualities that we can never seem to get rid of.
Yeah, like the modernists are very happy to say the Egyptians were wrong.
A fact as a fact for all time is the thing that is being prodded at here. Because we can say only from our particular perspective, once tuberculosis has been discovered, but it's also been constructed at the same time. There is obviously, what is tuberculosis? Is it germs or
yeah,
virus?
I guess it's a bacterial lung infection, yeah.
Whatever it is, that thing is real, but it has no causal efficacy until it has gone through a process of being named, being established, being considered at this point a fact, and today it is a fact. But then to say he died from it, while that is true in the medical sense, it's also separating tuberculosis from the network that produced tuberculosis as a knowledge object, including the production of presumably what's a pretty accurate method of what's ever required to pull apart a mummy and do tests on its tissues and rule out every other option.
Yeah, like we want to get behind these facts and see how they are produced and not just take them for granted, right? Not just the facts themselves, but the process of, making something a fact or confirming that something is indeed a fact and confirming that something's not a fact. The work that goes into that kind of thing is incredible. And it's kind of like, there's a few different angles too, right? Like if you're an anthropologist and Latour and his co-authors and his cohort, very influenced by anthropology. So what did the Egyptians think about how this person died? Like how did tuberculosis, if it was endemic in Egypt, how did it fit into their culture? How did they respond to it? How did they shape it? And like you also ignore all these questions, it's that classic thing, right? The moderns, like SoCal, think that the ancients are misguided, and eventually modern science wins out over ancient superstition. And that's kind of been the story of the last 250, 300 years of progress, right? The modern ways are displacing the ancient ways, right? Tuberculosis is in nature. So whatever culture thinks about nature is irrelevant because culture is a separate sphere that has nothing to do with nature, or it's something we can clearly and distinguish, right? And he wants to flip all this upside down.
Cool.
He wants to turn this around and get behind what's going on here with this modernism.
So how do we get under facts? Because they can be got under. But if we are never modern, what does it mean to be modern? We usually talk about postmodern, and I often refer to modernism as a shorthand. But if we are never modern, how do we even do this? First, people were doing Dark Age shit, whatever they were doing. They were doing philosophy. They were doing primitive philosophy like Thomas Aquinas, who is just a monkey with a typewriter. And Duns Scotus. Duns Scotus actually gets citations, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone who is not like a Catholic cite Aquinas in my life.
Yeah.
I have tried to read him, I think in undergrad, but he's like, first of all, he's the most boring guy to have ever written anything, which the stories confirm.
Oh, scholastics in general are a bit like that.
Well, even in his bros hired a hooker and locked her in a room with him so that he would get laid, but he like chased her off with a fire poker because he didn't want to lose his virginity. So then just sat in a room and read Aristotle his entire life. Anyway, there you go. There's a portrait that is pre-modernism.
Yeah.
And then modernity is Descartes coming in to sweep the floor and say, how do I really know if I'm sweeping the floor or if I'm dreaming? But by the way, God is also real. And then
Yeah.
you get the Rousseau and you get the Kant, and we were modern until, I guess, Lyotard said that, hey, we're not really modern anymore. But this is an interesting thesis here, because you can't be postmodern if we've never been modern. So modern here obviously explains a method of thought and thought about thought, I'd say. And it does in this book too. So modern thought as opposed to traditional thought. Traditional thought is flawed, not evidence-based. Modern thought, we move away from tradition. Descartes to Nietzsche. Descartes' always the punching bag.
Yeah, and his substance dualism, right? That's kind of a early version of what's going on here. This conceit that we have never been modern. Yeah, it's very much in the vein of anti-Cartesian thinking, where we don't want a mind-body dualism, or even kind of anti-Kantian thinking, where we don't want to have a kind of transcendental subjectivity through which the world is filtered and you can never get to the thing in itself, whatever the hell that is. If Kant really ever said anything like that about the thing in itself, who knows? But that's kind of become a lot of people know, but that's become the kind of firm position of Kant's in popular philosophy, is that he said, well, you cannot know or touch or ever get to the thing in itself, which he never said. But
the reason I think that probably Bruno Latour is up at number 10 on this citation list is because he's here deconstructing, not Derrida deconstructing, but investigating, we'll say, the subject-object duality, and then right downstream from subject-object duality is the nature-culture duality. So you've probably heard this before, because this is one of those like critical theory sins that is super bad. You're not supposed to do the subject-object duality. If you do, you're a bad person. That's a bad Descartes thing.
You're promoting a reactionary position. You're a modernist.
I don't know. You probably do this in like fourth year undergrad, and certainly in any graduate seminar, you're gonna run into the sin of the subject-object duality. But that's kind of what Latour is producing here, just demonstrating how hard it is to actually come to what we call, in shorthand, a scientific fact, and how long the process is, and how many people are involved in the process. And then we get the end result and then treat it almost as if that social aspect or the political aspect of the fact never happened.
Yeah.
And we should say, too, we're giving you kind of the conclusion of his arguments, where if you actually like read his writing, he does this. He does this with like pasteurization, for example, how pasteurization got produced.
Yeah, and it's an interesting book to get into, because he really starts this book in a very in a defensive crouch, basically. Like, he's talking about critics, he's anticipating incomprehensibility towards what he's talking about right now. Basically, he's just anticipating that if what he's saying can't be divided into nice disciplinary containers, right? Sociologists study these things and not those things, because those things are for the scientists, but they don't study how science works. That's for the science studies people, right? So we have these separate compartments, right? And he starts in a defensive crouch saying, well, the way I'm going to talk about this is I'm going to link across these divisions. I don't care, these separations. I'm going to link across them. And he starts, I wish I could read newspapers like Latour can. It's really fun. He starts off with like reading a bunch of, just him reading a newspaper. And he talks about all these different things that these stories are bringing together, all these different actors, things, people, institutions. They're all weaving together in these stories. He says, like, on page 4 of my daily newspaper, I learned that the measurements taken above the Antarctic are not good this year. The hole in the ozone layer is getting bigger. Reading on, I turned from the upper atmosphere to the chief executive officer of Atochem and Monsanto. So we're bringing in these companies now. Monsanto's got a nasty reputation there. And then he starts talking about chlorofluorocarbons, crimes against the ecosphere. Then we get into moral and political debates. And so he weaves all these things together. And he says this is the way that science studies should work, is we shouldn't, break these things off such that the measurements of the ozone layer would be for the scientists and nobody else. Monsanto, whatever they do, they're economic. We don't deal with them. They're regulated by the politicians, but the politicians aren't scientists. So they need you see what I mean? It's always difficult it's a little difficult to key in to his style of thought because of this kind of, I can't help but think this is rhizomatic, right? These are rhizomes. When he says network, I hear rhizome. When he says thread, I hear line of flight, right? All these different ways through something that ignore these, in this case, disciplinary divisions. And he uses the analogy of Ariadne's thread to what these stories are doing. They're threading together all of these different aspects. And Ariadne's famously the ancient Greek princess who helped Theseus get back out of the labyrinth after killing the Minotaur, and then he abandoned her on the island of Naxos and fucked off. Not a very thankful or good guy, but that's who she is. But this thread is the metaphor here. And so the thread, a single thread, links the most esoteric sciences and the most sordid politics, the most distant sky in some factory in the Lyon suburbs, dangers on a global scale in the impending local elections, or the next board meeting. Like that was a quote. So he's weaving together these things using the metaphor of the thread, which is like what newspaper stories are doing. You could go through today's Democracy Now! And look at, nuclear plant in Ukraine. The head of a Russian hired paramilitary organization. Politics in the East. Biden is in Sweden right now doing something. All these different things. What's going on in Sweden? They're trying to join NATO, but people are burning Korans and Iranians are getting pissed off, and so now you have religion in there too. Like there's, he's doing this sort of thing. He's trying to methodologize. That's not a word, but now it is. He's trying to put a method to these things, which we're going to eventually know as actor network theory, or ANT for short. But that doesn't come until a bit later. But this book kind of just breaks the ground for that, and this is the problem.
I'm not really sure who he's attacking, because it seems like the things that he is writing here have been things that have, gained notoriety and popularity. And we like things like, multidisciplinarity and all that stuff. So the context seems a little foreign because of how defensive he starts. But basically, you don't cut off. I think the people that he's probably attacking are pop scientists, the scientists that are not really scientists, but they come out and go, look, everyone, there are scientific facts. You can't debate these things. And the pop scientists aren't having a good go around in our day because of TikTok. Like, how do mirrors work? How do mirrors see? Soon we're going to have an entirely new competitive apparatus for explanations of phenomenon that the pop scientists, they're too boring to compete with, frankly. Who wants to hear about the fact that light can reflect when you can consider the alternative hypothesis that the mirror universe, where we have locked them into only repeating our actions forever, but they're biding their time until they will have revenge and emerge from the mirrors and take over reality prime.
Yeah. This is like a bit of politics in here too with the book, because of this. I think some of his critics are also like disciplinarian academics too, like old school disciplinarian academics, like the type like Roger Dawkins, right? You can't say anything new about genetics because you're wrong, because he already figured it all out. All we needed was Darwin and then Mendel, and then we just needed modern mathematics and computers. And then we got Darwin, and that's the end of the story. If you say anything about symbiogenesis, you're a communist freak.
Yeah, Roger Dawkins is the mirrorverse, the mirror world version of Richard Dawkins. Somehow he's even worse. But no, this is to say we can't separate. Here's all the human stuff on one side. Human stuff, it's confusing. People are idiots. They do a bunch of random shit, and who knows what they're going to do. But then over here, we have our little island of science. Science is based on facts, and these two worlds are separate. So his way of separating it, I mean, we're prefacing actor network theory, but Latour wants to treat all these different things that we're bringing up as actants, I think is his term for it. That's the actor in the actor network theory. So if we want to have a theory of how science came to be what it is, or anything else for that matter, you have to just look at actants and the network that they're a part of. So an individual person can be an actant. So can tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is an actant. An idea can be an actant. A religion interpreting a specific idea can be an actant. And you're not going to get an actual picture of how whatever final truth emerges, because a final truth is never going to ultimately emerge, but you're never going to have a picture of how this rhizome is running into itself and reconnecting and making different connections, and in some cases being cut off, like maybe with cloning. There's tons of laws against cloning, so in that case the state would be some sort of actant, and the people who want to do cloning and say, science for science sake, that's a type of actant.
Yeah.
So anyway, we have all these actants in all these networks. They're competing, they're fighting for energy, they're fighting for resources, they're encouraging each other sometimes, fighting against each other other times. And to treat science as its own private island, like a lot of STEM types would like to think it is, that's just not what happens. And if you look back, if you take a historical perspective is what modernity is. Modernity is to look at history and to explain away the complexity and give a simple explanation. In the modern period, we replaced Aquinas and tradition and primitive animism and so on. I mean, I'm still going to use the term modernity, but to use the term modernity is to reproduce something very low fidelity, because low fidelity is easier to draw grand conclusions about. And actor network theory is, attempting to produce some high fidelity picture, which is a lot more work.
Yeah, that thread, just to carry on with that thread metaphor a bit, since it kind of opens the book and it kind of puts it in this way of, well, who's cutting the Gordian knot here? Well, life is like, I guess this is like almost like a theory of what is like tangled threads forming a kind of Gordian knot, right? Everything is all mixed together. Life is messy. He calls it, actually, it's funny. Another STS, John Law, calls it a mess instead of a network.
Acronym drop.
Sorry, science, technology, and society, or just science studies for short. That's a kind of just a shorthand for like what Latour is doing, is science studies. He did his earlier work on Louis Pasteur and the discovery of the pasteurization process. Because surely pasteurization has always been around, but just nobody's ever done it. But it's always existed, right? Yeah, Brickmont, you're right about that. No, so he did this early work on that. These are the science studies people. He looked at lab reports. He read the words of Pasteur, and he traced all the connections and political and everything else, whatever. So he calls all this like a knot, right?
He actually did field work too.
Yeah.
I think in Africa, which is again to show that, theorists who want to sit around and theorize always end up coming with simple pictures, and he's arguing for a complicated picture that takes work. Ew.
Yeah, and like these kinds of people, they'll study objects. It's a kind of object-oriented or material culture-oriented sort of study. So yeah, Latour's some of his early works on Louis Pasteur and the anthrax bacterium. Some Michel Calon, another famous one. Here's the example. He did fuel cell electrodes. And so you just take this sort of thing, whatever it is, and you trace all the connections it runs through, all the different spheres that its, I don't know, journey through existence takes it into, instead of dividing it into separate spheres, into disciplinary silos, because that's cutting the Gordian knot, right? That's what he says. They cut the Gordian knot with a well-honed sword. The shaft is broken. On the left, they have put knowledge of things. On the right, power and human politics. You cut the Gordian knot and you sort things into those two containers. So you'll call them. In his later work, he comes up with another analogy. This is like describing a war, and you start with all the guns and equipment on the one side and all the naked soldiers on the other side, and you proceed to dialectically relate them together. And that's how you describe a war when you have cut the Gordian knot, right? And he says, no, me and my friends, we want to retie the Gordian knot. And he says, quote here, retie the Gordian knot by crisscrossing as often as we have to the divide that separates exact knowledge and the exercise of power, let us say nature and culture, right? This is his method of translation. And I'm going on, but I can illustrate this really well with a stop sign, right? A stop sign is a cultural thing. It's a sign. You have to know what it means. You have to be from that culture. You have to be socialized. You have to know what it means. But you can ignore that stop sign. Fuck it. Lots of people do. Blow through it. Fuck it. So how do you translate from culture to nature or a material thing? You put a sleeping policeman there, as they call them in England. You put a speed bump. And now you have translated this imperative to stop, this cultural imperative, this meaningful sign that you should stop here, into a more coercive method of if you run past this, you will ruin your car suspension and have a big bill at the mechanic. And so this is his, that's what he's saying here. I'm going to crisscross between knowledge of things and exercises of power, right? We have to have knowledge of the stop sign, the cultural side. We have to have the power to stop people. And you can put that on the material side with the speed bump, put it on the cultural side with the please stop here, sir, request. You can do it that way. He talks about door hinges. He's all over the place with this stuff, but this is his strategy, right? Translation between those kinds of trying to retie the Gordian knot in that way and acknowledge he doesn't like these words, but like the complexity or the systematicity of life.
Well, even if I accept your premise here, Eric Latour, surely there has always been tuberculosis. We just didn't know that there was. Why would you call this an invention and say that someone didn't die of tuberculosis when we have evidence that they did? How are you helping here?
Well, another thing you could look at is you could look at tuberculosis as an event, right? You could look at it as an event. Events take place at greater or slower speeds, greater or lesser speeds. And the discovery of tuberculosis just took thousands and thousands of years. It's an event. It happened. It started maybe with this ancient Egyptian pharaoh, maybe earlier, and it was completed, maybe still kind of ongoing because we're still dealing with tuberculosis, unfortunately. So maybe that event actually hasn't reached its horizon yet. But that's Whitehead philosophy, which Latour is extremely influenced by.
Ayo.
And that might be another way to look at it, look into a little bit into his influences in that way. Instead of cutting it up again and saying, what the Egyptian thought about it, that's the job of the archaeologists and anthropologists. What it is, that's the job of the scientists. What we do about it now that it's been discovered, that's the job of the politicians. There you go. Nice, neat divide, right? Cut the Gordian knot, sort it out into those little containers, neat and tidy. We can understand it now. And that's why he's against his critics, right? Saying they're not going to understand this. And the reason is they are addicted to the modernist settlement, as he calls it, this modernist constitution where you have, well, like I said, nature on one side, non-humans on that side too, and you have humans and culture and politics and power on the other side.
Okay.
And that's the problemo he's trying to deal with. He's trying to retie that knot.
So if we have someone, I'm trying to provoke you here a little bit. If we have someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson who goes, people can be at war, they can be fighting, they can be funding. It doesn't matter if they're doing any of those things or not. We know that there are facts. We know that there are electrons. Why does it matter what all those people are doing if we are just scientists and we only just care about what these electrons are doing and we want to have a theory of magnetism or something like that? Why do we need to know all the rest of that shit?
Yeah, theory of magnetism and the rest of that shit. Well, I guess you want to know the motivations behind the theory of magnetism, right? I mean, you could just, if you just break off a little piece and look at, say, science and politics, just forget about all the other things for a second. Say science and politics, they're supposed to be completely separate things, right? Science isn't influenced by politics, and politics kind of uses science in a practical way, but isn't sort of interested in its theoretical side. It's basically separate. They don't influence each other, right? So he wants to blow this view out of the water completely. And I'm not going to be able to find the quote quickly that rebuts that. But yeah, I mean, what about the motivations behind doing this research in the first place? What about the funding? Who funded it? Right? Did they think they were going to make a profit, or was it a public funded thing? If it was public funded, was it paid for by taxes? Did you get people to agree to it? And of course, that has nothing to do with magnetism itself, but this is the method. This is the method, right? When you cut that Gordian knot, as I was saying, you sort of make things a little bit incomprehensible. I don't know, in the sense that we live our lives in these extraordinarily complicated, tangled up situations, and our disciplines give us an image of the world that's just like neat and tidy and everything has its place. And we got to get rid of that view because it is holding us back.
Yeah, speaking of, we have this the Oppenheimer movie is coming out soon. Would we have discovered?
Yes.
For sure, it's a fact. There's no way that we would have discovered nuclear fission at the rate and speed at which we did if we were not at war. And I say we, I don't know why I say we, but Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer, all that shit, tons of funding. He's like, he just has to say, you know what? If you give me a shitload of money, I'm going to be able to make a bigger bomb than any bombs you guys have. And they go, okay, sure. So this was bringing back to mind the thought that I have of where this matters. How do you interject this? So we have archaeological facts like, okay, at some point we moved from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And this is one of those low fidelity stories that we were referring to earlier. A low fidelity story that there's like these brackets on history and there's a shift and we can like pinpoint a time in which this shift happened. And it's so vague as to like, how do you evaluate its truth when you're talking about something so vaguely? And when we were talking about the David Graeber book, The Dawn of Everything, sorry, the Davids.
The Davids.
Graeber's the first name, but Wengrow's, we can't forget about Wengrow. Anyway, we have iron. And what I found striking about the explanation of the iron thing is if we have the Age of Empires view of history, it's like people are constantly at war, constantly going out and trying to find better ways to kill each other. But with the invention of iron, which comes from mining, invention, not really, but discovery or use of iron, first you have to have a lot of irons around. Why was there a lot of iron around? Because of mining. Why were they mining? Because they wanted to dye their clothes. But if you take a fact like, oh, humans are a warlike species, they're always or same with gunpowder, right? Gunpowder was invented thousands of years ago, not used as gunpowder. It wasn't used for guns. It was used for fireworks. So if you take a fact and try to isolate it from the context, then you can draw these conclusions like humans are constantly in a war of all against all, trying to kill each other. Every time they discover something, it's with the intent to kill each other. When you discover these things that define ages of warfare, and it turns out, no, people wanted to dye clothes and make fireworks. And that gives you a completely different overall picture of what you're using as a fact to prove. And in this case, it would be something like an archaeological record. When you look at the record and the fact with its network, people are vain. People care about clothes. They care about the color of their clothes. They care about parties, fireworks. And then you get a very different picture from, oh, we needed to find something to kill each other better. And that's why iron became important to human civilization, or that's why gunpowder came to be important to civilization. If you put it in the network, you're going to get a very different picture than you would if you start with basically a conclusion and then apply the facts to it.
Yeah.
Now, as opposed to iron and as opposed to gunpowder, the Manhattan Project was the kind of thing where it was a conscious decision to fund, to discover, to do experiments with the express purpose that, you know, if you give us this much money, we can help you win the war and kill as many people in as horrifying a way as possible. But to say that that is why science is done, of course, would be one of those stories that isn't true in most cases.
And I mean, it's even, yeah, he kind of blames this on the philosophers of science too for making such a, how does he describe it? A sacred space out of facts. If the like so let's say I was just talking about, or we were just talking about various things, and then we maybe scientific facts, and then we start talking about politics, and then the critic goes, but hold on. You're not talking about science then. You're talking about politics. You're reducing scientific truth to mere political interests. That's what I've done. I've said, what about the motivations behind the atom bomb or something, right? It's war, you were saying, or something like that, right? You're just reducing it to political interests. Here's another misunderstanding. If the facts, here's the sort of warrant for this. If the facts do not occupy the simultaneously marginal and sacred place of our worship has reserved for them, then it seems that they are immediately reduced to pure local contingency and sterile machinations. Yet science studies are talking not about the social context and the interests of power, but about their involvement with collectives and objects. That's right. The social context, interests of power, not about them, but about their involvement with collectives. And collective here is the better term for social, because social just means humans. Collectives means a collective of humans and non-humans. Now, if you're in your room alone and you think you're a social being, and look around you and see if there are more humans or things around you, right? I live alone, and I'm constantly, my collective is quite populated, but there's not too many humans here, except virtually when I do this. But, you know, that's one of the misunderstandings that, again, these critics are reading their works. Presumably, they've all published things and received these kinds of critiques. And now Bruno Latour is writing this new book, We Have Never Been Modern, to try and take these things head on because they're getting a bit out of control. And he says, yeah, so once you go in to start talking about politics, then you're relating it to collectives and objects. He says, I will use the word, he says here, collective, to describe the association of humans and non-humans. And I'll use society to designate one part of our collectives. the divide invented by the social sciences, right? And that word, you should hear an echo in it, because it's never clear until a second reading which words are important in Bruno Latour, because he doesn't highlight all of them. Association. You hear that word social in there, right? Association is an active thing that you do on a daily basis. That's what keeps society going. So society is not like, the social isn't just like a metaphysical glue that holds us all together, right? This associative networks are networks that we maintain in the same way that he would say a baboon tribe on a daily basis reaffirms hierarchies. It tests the boundaries. It tries to get the mates it wants and it gets smacked down. It tries to do this. They're constantly reaffirming their social milieu. It's not a thing that's just taken for granted and existing there behind us like some kind of magical threads that tie us all together. No, these things take work to maintain and preserve, and if we don't do that, they'll fall apart or they'll change on us. And we don't want that. The context and the technical content turn out to be redefined every time, he says. So this is his rebuff to that kind of thing, is saying, well, you're not talking about science anymore, you're talking about politics. Well, no, I'm not. I'm talking about how they're involved in collectives and with objects, right? Objects, things, the other half of the collective that's not society, that we always forget about. I mean, what would society be without cell phones and computers? It would be a lot different, right? Not just like, I guess when the radio came out, people were like, what would society be without the radio? I'm inventing a magical box that can receive invisible signals from miles away. That sounds like insanity. Here it is. It's called a radio.
So I want to turn this, because it looks like a lot of the attack is at Science Island, but really exactly the same critique of separating and like putting your discipline outside of all of these other matters of concern applies also to philosophy, and it applies also to political theory, where the disciplines sort of, before they even start, purge on purpose or just for contingent reasons. They purge their discipline of all the things that they don't want to look at. So for philosophy, you might call it, we want to look at ideas and the history of ideas. For political theory, we want to look at what we think is the ideal organization of a group of people, and we're just going to engage with the history of people who discussed different organizations of people. But I guess an actor network theory of any discipline must be really hesitant to leave anything out, which makes it, again, a lot of work. It's saying you can never isolate the object of your inquiry. You can't just talk purely about ideas. You cannot talk purely about humans as if they exist in a vacuum without any of the other shit that humans have around them. So this would just, I think, would just give you a much more interesting picture of reality if you start from networks. So even a highway network. How has highways shaped American society? Because you can definitely see that it has the arrangement of people, where people have settled, why we have roads here, why we don't have roads here. The highways system in North America, as opposed to the European lack thereof highway system. It creates a different sense of sociality. It creates different regional relative power differentials. It creates different genres of film, just having a highway system. So yeah, I don't know, this is coming out of my ass, but so what if you, just a what if you started your political theory using the materiality of highways, rather than starting with the theoretical question of what is the best organization of humans?
Yeah, and we all kind of have that idea that highways have a kind of military origin too.
Yeah, they were, at least in America, they were built out of like concrete so that tanks could drive on them if it was ever required.
Yeah, the Canadian National Railway was being built in the early 20th century through the prairies, and then they started calling people over to live there, and they wanted like Polish people and people like Central Eastern European and English to come and populate these prairies because they needed people out there to make the CNR worth building further. And then that stopped. And then when that became a problem, well, guess where documentary filmmaking was invented? In Canada. Guess what one of its first uses was? To go get people from Europe to live here. They made nice little videos of I don't know, the Canadian wilderness and kind of prairie life and a kind of idyllic, except no scenes of snow. That was a rule with these early ones, no snow scenes. And then they shipped them off to England and showed them in the theaters, and people saw them, and then they were actually offered a stipend of land if they would just come move here. And then it turns out it was really fucking boring for them to live out in the prairies and be isolated from their communities. But anyway, like that's just another...
I didn't know that. That's cool. Documentary film propaganda.
That is a socio-technical imbroglio.
Yeah, but we need people. Well, we need white people, really. So how do we get white people? We create technological objects and send them back to where white people are to seduce them to move to Saskatchewan. Hopefully they survive the winter.
Yeah, and then soon after that, we had the National Film Board of Canada, which is super famous, about 1 kilometer from this location.
So this is, I guess, to say there are no neutral facts. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, there are no isolated facts. I would say there's no such thing as an isolated fact. Everything exists in these networks, right? Everything is relative. Everything is relational. You can think of these networks as networks of relations, but the relations are not secondary to the things that are related. They are actually integral to the terms of the relations. So a fact about a thing points to a relation. Actually, on the topic of what is a fact, my boy Charles Sanders Peirce has a really good definition of a fact. He says, a relation is a fact about a number of things. Thus, the fact that a locomotive blows off steam constitutes a relation, or more accurately, a relationship between the locomotive and the steam. In reality, every fact is a relation. Thus, that an object is blue consists in the peculiar regular action that the object has on human eyes. This is what should be understood by the relativity of knowledge. All facts, end quote. In other words, all facts are relations and all knowledge is relative, but not in the cultural relative sense, but in the network sense, right?
And I just heard 1,000 people have an aneurysm. These people, when I say these people, I mean, because you said the bad word, relativism. I should probably think through what type of person this is, but they're sort of a conservative, not even a political conservative, but a broad view intellectual type person with this conservative viewpoint. They probably read New Yorker magazine or like TED Talks, but relativism for them is sinful. And you know what? I don't know why it's sinful. Even in the academic philosophy writing that corresponds to this position that I've read lately, relativism is just not an option. It can't be done because somehow it's morally stinky. So it's theoretically acceptable or even responsible to just find a position that you can call relativism and then dismiss it out of hand and replace it with your new meta theory or whatever. Just go away, okay? Relativism just means that the closer that you look at things, the more relations you find, not whatever truth atoms. Anyway, Eric, I wanted to ask you about the title one more time. What does it say or what does it suggest to say we've never been modern? Was that some sort of fantasy that took over? Or how do you read that title, knowing Latour as well as you do?
Right. So we have never been modern. So we know about all the different, we know about the moderns, let's say, and we know about the prefixes that now go along with modern, right?
You mean like post?
Yeah. So the way...
Post and anti.
Yeah, so modern is well, he defines it. He says the adjective modern designates a new regime, an acceleration, a rupture, a revolution in time. So on the one side of the definition, modern references the passage of time. When the word modern, modernization, or modernity appears, we're defining by contrast an archaic and stable past. The word is always being thrown into the middle of a fight, into a quarrel where there are winners and losers, ancients and moderns, right? Modern is thus a doubly asymmetrical, a break in time and combat where there are victors and vanquished, losers and winners, whatever the moderns and the ancients. Our knowledge is superior to those who went before us. Modern introduces this double asymmetry. And it evolved over the ages, probably, I don't know, Descartes' conflict with the scholastics, right? The moderns and the ancients, right? The ancient way of doing things. They coexisted, by the way. They weren't ancients, but they were representing the old ways. That's what modern kind of does. It makes people into passé while they're still alive. So we have to rethink this definition. And what he goes through is when we start to lose trust in the solidity of this disciplinary situation, it creates reactionary positions. And he calls them, anti-modernists and postmodernists, or you could say anti-modernist or reactionary socialists who say, let's just have autocratic rule. That's the way Zizek seems to be going. Or we have reactionary neoliberals who are just like free market, fuck everything else. Or we get postmodern skeptics who kind of suspend facts between belief and doubt in this weird space where you can't really say it's true, you can't really say it's false, because what do those words mean anyway? It's kind of discursive. Those are meaning effects. It's a language game kind of thing. So you get these kinds of different reactionary positions: postmodernism, anti-modernist conservatism, and a kind of I don't know how he's really fitting the Marxist picture in here, but he's in 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, first climate change conference. Fall of the Berlin Wall freed people from the tyranny of Stalinism, and ironically then replaced the elites back in the factories, back into the ownership positions. They became capitalists. So we replaced tyranny with domination. And then everyone's happy, right? But no, wait. Climate change conference happens. Now the masses are fucked because the ecosystem is no longer going to be sustaining these people. So they're going to be progressively shifted into poverty. So we have this like kind of double movement that's tearing apart our faith in the modern constitution way of doing things, that maybe we do have to look at politics and the climate and war and material substances as all connected and not divide them into these different, circuits. And then he'll go back and trace the origin of the modern constitution to a conflict between someone we spoke about last week a little bit, Hobbes, and the other guy, not Rousseau, but Boyle, Robert Boyle, the guy who is...
I did so much research on this because I wanted to understand what was happening, but we're already like at the end of the episode, which sucks. But no,
I know
like Hobbes, they were doing experiments on air pumps and like creating vacuums, and then the effect of vacuum. So he's like create a vacuum, not a vacuum cleaner, obviously, but like create a space with no air in it, and then he'd put like bugs in there and be like, bugs can't fly, and then try to find all these or try to describe for the first time what air is, which seems to us such a foreign concept. But they could do the laboratory experiments and then decide what air was. But then they had a whole debate over what the consensus means in terms of what do we decide air is now that I've had my laboratory conditions as opposed to general conditions.
Well, the short version of it really is that, Hobbes and Boyle were both cut from the same cloth. They're both really into mechanical science, like they were the mechanistic materialism of the day. And they were both, well, here's a quote. They agree on almost everything. They want a king, a parliament, a docile and unified church. They are fervent subscribers to mechanistic philosophy. Okay, so they agree on so many things. They're both thoroughgoing rationalists, but their opinions diverge as to what can be expected from experimentation, from scientific reasoning, and from political argument. So the politics guy is Hobbes, but Hobbes did science, and the science guy is Boyle, but Boyle was interested in politics. We tend to overlook these things because Hobbes' science writings is bananas, but he was interested in it.
It really was.
Yeah. And political theorists who, like Hobbes, are kind of embarrassed by it. But the disagreements, he says here, just to finish, the disagreements between the two men who agree on everything else makes them the ideal laboratory material, the perfect fruit flies for the new anthropology. And that's what he's in that. So he's going to look at the way that this division between politics and science originates in this area that Hobbes and Boyle happen to disagree upon, which is the consequences of experiment science and politics, right? What consequences are they going to have for society? They disagreed on what those consequences would be, and it ultimately ended up in this modern constitution where we have politics and nature completely separate. Mm-hmm. And then Latour next book, I think, is called The Politics of Nature.
Yeah.
He dives into it more. But yeah.
And then these days you have kind of band-aid solutions to it, which is like, oh no, we should give oceans rights. Now, we kind of should give oceans rights, but it's a little late now, and we don't consider oceans to be like agentic beings. So anyway, that split was maintained, but the split wasn't ever actually maintained. There was never actually just a full vacuum where politics did not enter science and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, the "we have never been modern" thing is really a lot like this invention discovery conundrum we started with. Is like, if all of these problems are here, but we can trace them back to their origin. Let's say Boyle and Hobbes are exemplary figures in the origination of this. We can trace it back to its origin. We can point to the problems it's causing. We can point to the reactions and how insufficient they are. He kind of unfairly uses E.O. Wilson, the sociobiologist, Bourdieu, the sociologist, who focuses on the social, and Derrida, who's a discourse textual-oriented philosophy. He says if all these kinds of reactions to this sort of lack of faith now in the modern constitution, if all these reactions fail, we need something else. And what that something else is a kind of anthropology that's attentive to politics as well. And that points us in this direction. And that direction is that division of time I mentioned earlier. If that collapses, there were really never ancients. There were really never moderns. There were only networks of people, renegotiating their social contexts and their technical apparatuses. That's what Hobbes and Boyle were doing. They were negotiating then and there their social context. Social context didn't shape them. That's what I was saying earlier. We're not interested in how social context shapes science, right? That's like, so scientists are a product of their social milieu, blah, blah, blah. That's old hat science studies. This new hat stuff looks at the ways that the actors in the situations negotiate their relationships to their contexts. So you're giving more, you're giving more to your actors, right? You're letting them actually tell you what they think about things and not just sort of ignoring them. A lot like Kondiaronk and those indigenous dialogues, right? Where you're not letting them speak. You're just assuming that they're puppets for a European self-critique and you erase their voices. He's got a somewhat parallel argument here about this. And I mean, on the strength of this, I mean, it's just to say we never were modern in the first place. This is a completely contingent and negotiated situation, and it's particularly durable. It's proven, but it's not forever, and we don't need to, be postmodernist if we don't like modernism any more than we need to be define ourselves as I don't know, atheists against theism. We were never theists, kind of thing, right?
Well, that's a good place to end it on, but I am looking for, like, considering Hobbes's batshit just scientific theories that he was allowed to come up with. The new site of the new science, I hope it's TikTok, because the world of TikTok has trolls and angels and mirrors that have their own private consciousnesses, and I really hope to see some new scientific theories emerge from there. We were never modern.
Hey-oh.
All right, with that, we will
Is that a wrap?
We'll wrap. We didn't get very far into the text. We got like 9 pages in.
I know, I've got too many anecdotes about my other readings from Latour. Oh my god.
No, it was good. It was good.
He's good though.
I like to hear it.
Beautiful prose.
All right, if you want to hear us talk more, join our network. Become an actor in our network on Patreon. And that's it from us this week.
Yeah, can't wait for the next imbroglio.
Cheers. I'm gonna go make a mojito. Peace, everyone.